In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to show you how to put in a traditional facing around the neckline, so stay tuned! Hello and welcome. I'm Akram Burris, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. In this Learn to Sew episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to be showing you how to put in a traditional neckline facing. So what exactly is a facing? Basically, if you take a look at this dress here around the neckline, when you go to complete your neckline, you'll end up with a raw edge and you'll want to turn that in. Now, to close off your raw edge so you don't see it on the inside and so that it doesn't unravel, you use another piece of fabric, which is wrong side to wrong side of the garment. And what this will do is it creates a crisp outer part for your neckline, and on the inside it encloses the raw edge and lays flat on the inside of your garment. So this is a basic sort of neckline facing that I have here in this jersey dress. For the project that we'll actually be working on in this episode, I will be using Vintage Simplicity pattern 7655, and as you can see, I've got it here on my mannequin tailor. And we're going to be finishing the collar facing, the neckline facing, with a traditional facing according to the pattern. Now, these techniques and tips that I'm going to show you in this video can apply to any garment that requires a neckline facing. So as you can see here in our dress, facing is one of the last steps in the construction of this project, and it typically is. You're going to put together your front and back pieces, sew up your side seams. A lot of times you're even going to put in the zipper. In this case, this dress has a collar, so before you put the facing for your neckline, you're going to attach the collar pieces. If there is no collar, you would attach the facing just like I'm going to show you. You would just omit having a collar in here. But as you can see, I've got the collar sewed in, and it's this is the front side, this is the inside here, and you can see this raw edge, and that's what the facing is actually going to cover up. So I'm going to put the facing where it's going to match up with the collar, and then it's going to fold inward to hide this raw edge. Let's take a look now at our facing pieces. Now, this is rather typical in most facing pattern pieces. It usually comes in two pieces, and this is because your garment typically will have a seam either in the back or the front, which is the closure, whether it's a zipper or button or whatever the case may be. So you can see piece F here is for our back, because we actually have a front opening dress, and it is placed on the fold, so this is going to open up. And then our second piece here, piece E, is cut, is two pieces. And so before we can actually sew this onto our dress, we're going to need to attach pieces E to piece F. And we're going to attach them here on the side seam. And as you can see, it has a standard 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these pieces together. And once you've got them sewn together, you're going to want to press open your side seams on the facing, and then when we've got it all sewn together and ready to go, I'm going to bring it back and show you how to attach it to our dress. Here is our neckline facing, and as you can see, I've sewn the side seams together. I've also done what is called a stay stitch. A lot of times when you're sewing with curves, you do a stay stitch, which is basically just the longest stitch, and it is oftentimes sewn at your seam allowance or just inside your seam allowance. And it's basically meant to give a structure to the curve so that it won't wrinkle or warp as you sew or over time. So when you're sewing a stay stitch, keep close eye on the pattern instructions, because it'll typically tell you which direction to sew that stay stitch to give better structure to your garment. So for example, these outer pieces were sewn to the outside, while the inner pieces were sewn in two parts, one side going in this way and one side going in this way. And then I've pressed my side seams open, and if you can take a look at the front here, and actually I'll turn it around. So this is actually, we have an opening in the front of our dress. So these two pieces are going to be the facing for the front, and this is my back. And if I turn it back around, you can see before I've even sewn it into the dress, I've sewn on my sewing label. So if you have a tag that you're wanting to put inside of your dress, typically that goes on the back collar neckline area, and this was where you would put that. You would put that on the facing. It just makes it a little bit easier. I've sewn it prior to sewing it in the dress. It makes it a little easier and more maneuverable. Now you will notice that we have a raw edge around the outside perimeter of our facing, and you want to go back to your pattern instructions and see what they say to do with that. According to my pattern instructions, it wants you to go ahead and turn over a 1/4 inch and stitch that all the way around so that you are encasing your raw edges. However, since I am actually working with a polyester type fabric, it's rather thick, and it's just going to give a really weird crease, that small little turn. So in my case, to finish the outer raw edge of the collar here, I'm going to be using my Fair pinking shears here and just pink the outside edges. And I'm going to go in that same 1/4 inch all the way around. Again, it's completely up to you how you want to finish your raw edge here. And if you're unfamiliar with seam finishes, you might want to check out one of our other Akram's Ideas Learn to Sew videos, which talks all about seam finishes and gives you a variety of options when it comes to finishing your seams. And so you can see I finished the outside raw edge with my pinking shears. The last thing that we want to do before we attach this to the collar is we're going to add some notches on the inside curve here, just so that this stretches a little better and makes it around our neckline. And we don't have to do too many of these notches. We're just going to do little triangle notches, just a couple of places throughout our facing. Here you can see I've clipped out a couple of notches just to give more stretch to our facing so that we can attach it to our garment. The next step is to basically take our dress over here, and we're going to match this up to our neckline. And again, my neckline has a collar piece. And we're going to do this right sides facing. So basically this is the outside of my dress, and I'm going to take the right side of my collar and I'm going to match those up. And we're going to match these up using our side seams as our main guide. So I'm going to take my side seam, match it up with my facing side seam, and then I'm going to do that on the other side. So here's my other side seam, and here's my facing side seam, and I'm going to match those two up. Now my particular pattern also has a couple of little notches that I can match up as well. You'll also notice in this particular pattern the facing piece actually extends past our collar, And there are different ways, depending on what the pattern instruction says, how they want you to finish this out. In my case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and turn it in so that it matches up, and I'll actually do a stitch down the end of it once I've got it all stitched in place. It wants you, according to the pattern instructions, to go ahead and slip stitch that by hand, but personally, I try to avoid any type of hand stitching if at all possible. So I'm actually going to go ahead and make it a little bit easier. I'm going to measure out till it gets to the end and then fold it back on itself and stitch it there. And then I'll stitch it down the outer side after I've got the collar all together. So I'm going to basically pin this all the way around, and I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch it at our standard 5/8 inch seam allowance at a standard stitch width. As you can see, I'm just sewing at the 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is this mark right here on my sewing machine, and I'm just going around the edge here, stitching our facing to our collar pieces right sides together. Now, as I mentioned before, we had that excess of our facing, and I've folded it over so that it matches up with our collar piece, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch that down here. Sometimes when you're dealing with bits of fabric where you've got it folded over, you'll want to put your needle down into the fabric, lift your presser foot, and make sure that lip of fabric goes under the presser foot so that it doesn't sew underneath it instead of over it. I'm going to take out my final needle here. And then back stitch at the very end. So you can see here I've stitched that down, stitched that over, but I still have this lip of fabric here. And since I don't want to hand sew this, I'm just going to take this. You can pin it if you want. I'm just going to take this to my sewing machine and just stitch all the way down, just in case this raw edge. And basically, I'm just going to do it this way here. It's going to go in about 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fold, and then back stitch to make sure that it gets the whole thing, and back stitch again. And then you're going to want to do that to the other side as well. Once I do the other side, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press this. I'm going to press the seam allowance and the facing to the same side so it ends up something like this. And then I'm going to bring it back to the sewing machine so that we can do what is called an understitch. And what we're going to do now is what we call understitching. And basically what that does is it sews the facing down to our seam allowance. And this gives a little bit more weight to the facing, which keeps it from coming out to the outside of the garment, keeps it on the inside. So what I've done is I've set my presser foot down just on that inside seam of the facing, and I've turned my needle to the right side, so it's going to be right on the right edge, and I'm going to be sewing the facing to the seam allowance. As we sew, you're going to be kind of checking with your hand to make sure that the seam allowance is not turned and that it is facing the same direction as our facing here. So I'm just going to go in here, and you're going to want to back stitch this too, so that, and you're just matching up your seam, your original seam here with the edge of your presser foot as you go around. And you're going to do that all the way around your neckline. Here you can see is my finished facing. It's been pressed inside and everything. There's a few more minor little things that we need to do. The first off, if I unzip this a little bit, you can see that the seam allowance here is pretty thick. It's got the inside garment, the collar pieces, and then the facing. So what I'm going to do is what we call grading the seam allowance. And what this does is it trims back each piece of this seam allowance in a gradation of sizes. The largest size being the size that faces the outside. So this is the outside of my garment. This inner piece here is going to be my largest, so I'm not actually even going to trim that piece at all. I'm going to trim the collar pieces here and then trim the inside here. Facing seam, which is the innermost seam here, I'm actually going to cut this the smallest. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this back a good amount. And again, you want to be very careful making sure that you're only getting the seam allowance for the facing. Now, I would do that all the way around, and then again, I'm noticing that the collar pieces, I'm going to cut those down, but only half as much as I cut the facing. So again, I'm not messing with the original dress line seam at all. And again, you want to be careful here that you're not cutting your original seam. And what you should see is something like this, where it's a step basically. Your facing seam allowance is the smallest. Your collar seam allowance is slightly smaller than, or slightly larger than that, and then your original dress is the full seam allowance, so that you get a little less bulk and it helps the facing lie down flatter. And you're going to do this all around the collar neckline. This is it. This is the completed neckline. We've done our grading. The only other thing is that in this particular pattern, up at the very front at the top zipper, it wants an eye hook. So I'm actually going to stitch down the facing when I apply the eye hook down here to keep that front flap from coming up. Another thing the pattern mentions, and which is quite common, is to take your facing and sort of tack it down with a couple of hand stitches to your side seam where the side seams meet up. And this again will just prevent your facing from popping up outside of your collar area or your neckline. But you can see this is pretty much how the finished garment's going to set. And here is our completed dress, our traditional facing at the neckline. Now, after putting this dress together, I determined that I would probably never wear it with the neckline closure all the way to the top. So I've decided to exclude the eye hook closure at the very top part of the neckline. And since that was the catch to hold our facing inside, I went ahead and just top stitched the facing just to the inside of our zipper. You're not going to see that top stitch because the collar actually sets right over that portion. So it was an easy and quick modification to make so that the dress was more wearable to my style. Also, if you would like to learn more about the process I went through to making the full dress itself with using Vintage Simplicity pattern number 7655, please visit Akram's Ideas blog. I do have a blog post out there talking about a few minor modifications that I made to the dress in order to get it to fit and to work out to my liking. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Akram's Ideas. And as always, don't forget to follow us on social media or subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.